Hey everyone, and welcome back for another deep dive. You guys know how much I love a good mystery. And today we're really diving into one that's a little bit uh, disturbing, to say the least.
It's definitely a case that sticks with you.
It is.
Huh.
And I'm really glad that you're here to help me sort of break it down.
Absolutely.
So Herb Baumeister,
Hmm.
um, American serial killer. I mean, those words alone are pretty heavy.
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack there.
There is, and we've got a lot of Wikipedia stuff for this one, so we're really just going for that straight facts approach today.
Yeah, I think that's the best way to handle a case like this.
Yeah, just stick to the information that we have available.
Right.
But yeah, his story, it's one of those that really get you thinking, like, how can someone like this exist?
Yeah, the duality of human nature. It's fascinating and terrifying at the same time.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So we're going to try to figure out, who Herb Baumeister was, what he did, and I think maybe even more importantly, how he was able to keep up appearances for so long.
Right, because that's a big part of this case. The deception.
The deception.
Yeah.
So let's start at the beginning, right? He was born in Indianapolis, Indiana in 1947.
Seems like a pretty normal start, right? Middle America, average childhood.
Yeah, on the surface, totally normal. But like we always say, right, those early years, they can sometimes hold the first clues.
Oh, absolutely. And with Baumeister, those clues were definitely there. Even as a kid, he was exhibiting some really unsettling behavior.
Like what kind of behaviors are we talking about?
Well, think urophilia, like an actual fascination with urine, accounts of him wanting to taste it. And it wasn't just a passing interest either. We're talking about urinating on a teacher's desk, that kind of thing.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and then you have this intense fascination with dead animals.
Yeah.
Bringing them home, dissecting them. It's a pattern of behavior that's, it's disturbing, to say the least.
Yeah, that's beyond disturbing. And was this something that, like, his family noticed, or was it kind of brushed aside?
I mean, it's hard to say for sure from the information we have, but it does seem like there was a lack of intervention, maybe some denial going on.
Yeah. And it's interesting because he was actually diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia and antisocial personality disorder as a teenager.
Right. A heavy combination of diagnoses, and that's something that we need to keep in mind as we go through his life, because those diagnoses, they don't excuse his actions, but they do provide some context.
Yeah, they help us to understand maybe the potential motivations or thought processes.
Exactly. And it makes you wonder if consistent treatment could have made a difference. But unfortunately, it seems like that wasn't really part of the picture.
So even with these really serious diagnoses, he's still able to function in society to a certain extent.
To an alarming extent, really, because despite these early warning signs, Baumeister went on to have what looked like a pretty typical adult life.
He had jobs out, married.
Yep, married Juliana Julie Sater in 1971. They had 3 kids.
Wow.
It's almost like a textbook example of keeping up appearances, except with this incredibly dark undercurrent.
Yeah, it's like that classic hiding in plain sight scenario. We
Yeah.
see it a lot with these types of cases.
Right, because we're not talking about someone who was living on the fringes of society. This guy founded the Save-A-Lot thrift store chain in 1988.
Wait, so he was like a successful businessman.
He was running a business, raising a family, seemingly living the American dream.
It's wild how someone can be so successful outwardly and yet be harboring such darkness underneath. It's like two completely separate realities.
That's exactly what makes this case so fascinating and so disturbing. How was he able to maintain this double life for so long? Was that outward success a way to blend in, to appear normal while still feeding those dark desires?
It's almost like the success was a shield.
It's a chilling thought. And it leads us right into the story of the I-70 Strangler, because while that case officially remains unsolved, investigators strongly believe that Herb Baumeister was the one responsible for those murders.
Okay, so let's talk about the I-70 Strangler then, because I know this is where things start to get really, really dark. We're talking about at least 11 young men who were killed between 1980 and 1991, most of them last seen at gay bars in Indianapolis.
Right. And the way they were found, it's just horrific. Naked or partially clothed, dumped near Interstate 70, often in rivers or ditches, all strangled.
It's a very specific and very disturbing MO.
And what's interesting is that the killings seemed to stop in 1991, the same year that Baumeister purchased Fox Hollow Farm.
The property that would later become so central to this case, it's like you had a new hunting ground, a place where he felt he could operate with even more secrecy.
It's a chilling thought. To really grasp the I-70 Strangler's methods, I think we need to look at a few specific cases.
Yeah, let's do that. So tell me about some of the victims.
Well, there's Michael Shong Petrie, just 15 years old. He was working as a male prostitute, and he disappeared after getting into a stranger's car. His body was later found strangled.
15 years old. It's heartbreaking.
Then you have Maurice Allen Taylor, a 22-year-old who also offered sexual services. He was found in Weasel Creek, likely strangled as well. And it wasn't just young adults who were targeted. Delvoyd Lee Baker was only 14 years old when he disappeared after getting into a blue van with a young white man.
Okay, the detail about the blue van, that's important because we know that Baumeister often drove a blue van to gay bars, presumably looking for victims.
Exactly. It's a piece of the puzzle that starts to fit. And then there's the case of Michael Andrew Riley. He was 22 years old, disappeared after leaving a nightclub with an unidentified man. And in this case, we actually have a witness who placed Baumeister with Riley that night.
Wow. So there's a direct connection.
There is. And sadly, Riley's body was also found strangled.
So we're seeing a clear pattern here. Young men, many connected to the gay community, disappearing under suspicious circumstances, and then later found murdered.
It's a truly disturbing pattern, and it's a pattern that would eventually lead investigators right to Fox Hollow Farm. But that's a story for another time.
Yeah, well, we'll have to take a break there and come back to that next time. This is already getting really intense.
Yeah, this case is definitely not for the faint of heart.
Definitely not. But we'll pick it up again soon and continue to delve deeper into the mysteries of Herb Baumeister and Fox Hollow Farm. Awesome. Thanks for listening, everyone, and we'll see you next time.
See you then.
Okay, so we're back, and we left off talking about the I-70 Strangler and how the investigation started to really zero in on Herb Baumeister.
Right, and now we got to talk about Fox Hollow Farm because that's where things took a truly horrific turn.
It's where that facade of the successful businessman completely crumbles.
It really does. It's a stark reminder that you never truly know what's going on behind closed doors.
This wasn't just some random location either. This was his home, the place where he lived with his family.
Yeah, and in 1994, his own son stumbles upon a human skeleton in the woods behind their house.
I can't even imagine what that must have been like for him.
Just awful. And then think about Baumeister, right? He has to come up with some explanation, some way to cover it up.
So what did he say?
He told his family it was an old medical skeleton that belonged to his father.
Wow, talk about desperate.
Right. But of course, that wasn't the end of it. 2 years later, in June 1996, investigators finally get a warrant to search Fox Hollow Farm.
And that's when the real nightmare begins.
It does. They unearthed bone fragments belonging to at least 11 different people, all hidden on his property.
It's mind-boggling to think about all those victims right there while he was living his life, acting like everything was normal.
It's a level of compartmentalization that's hard to fathom, and the truly tragic part is that only 8 of those victims have ever been identified.
So there's still families out there who don't know what happened to their loved ones.
Exactly, and to make matters even more complicated, a new search was conducted in 2022, and they found even more bones and potential burial sites.
It's like this case just keeps unfolding even decades later.
It does. The Hamilton County Coroner's Office is actually still working to identify almost 10,000 bone fragments from Fox Hollow Farm. It's a massive undertaking.
Yeah, but hopefully it'll bring some answers for those families who are still waiting.
Every piece of information counts. So of the victims we do know about, we have John Lee Baer, Jeffrey Allen Jones, Richard Douglas Hamilton Jr., and Alan Lee Livingston all disappeared in 1993.
And then in 1994, Stephen Sperlin, Hale Allen, Wayne Broussard, and Roger Allen Goodlett vanish.
And in 1995, Michael Frederick Kern goes missing.
It's a long and tragic list. And it's amazing to think that they're still identifying victims all these years later. Like Manuel Rosendez, he disappeared in 1993, and they just identified him in January of this year.
Yeah, 2024. That's incredible. And then there's the case of Jerry Williams Comer. He disappeared in 1995. And while his remains were never found at Fox Hollow Farm, investigators still believe that Baumeister was involved.
So it's possible that there are even more victims out there that we don't know about.
It's very possible, especially considering his connection to the I-70 Strangler killings.
So how did it all finally fall apart for Baumeister? How did he go from this seemingly untouchable figure to being exposed?
Well, it started with investigators in Marion County and Indianapolis. They were starting to notice a pattern in these disappearances of young men in the early 90s.
And then they get this key witness, Tony Harris.
Right. Harris comes forward with this story about a guy who called himself Brian Smart. Harris believed that Brian Smart was responsible for the death of his friend Roger Goodlett, one of the victims later found at Fox Hollow Farm.
So Harris actually met Baumeister without knowing who he really was.
Yeah, and it's a chilling encounter. Harris described Brian Smart trying to kill him during an erotic asphyxiation session.
Oh, my
He
God.
barely managed to escape, and he got Brian Smart's license plate number.
So that was the connection.
Police traced the plate back to Baumeister. They confronted him, told him he was a suspect in the disappearances, asked to search his house.
And I'm guessing he refused.
He and his wife both refused. But by that point, the pressure was mounting. Julie Baumeister had actually already filed for divorce.
I bet she must have been terrified.
She was. And in a really brave move, she consented to a search of their property while Baumeister was on vacation.
Wow, good for her.
That search was the turning point. It led directly to the discovery of those 11 bodies at Fox Hollow Farm. But by then, Baumeister was already gone.
He knew it was over.
He fled to Ontario, Canada, where he ended up taking his own life in Pinery Provincial Park. He chose suicide over facing justice.
A tragic end to a horrific story. But there's one last piece of this puzzle. His suicide note.
Right. In his note, he expresses remorse for his failing business, but there's absolutely no mention of the murders, no accountability, no explanation for the pain he inflicted.
It's like he was trying to erase that part of himself, even in death.
It's incredibly frustrating. We're left with so many unanswered questions. What drove him to commit these acts? Was it the mental illness, the pressure of maintaining this double life, or something else entirely?
Those are questions that will probably haunt this case forever. You know, it's hard to wrap my head around the fact that someone could live such a double life for so long. But Herb Baumeister's story really proves that appearances can be totally deceiving.
Yeah, and even after uncovering all these horrific details, we're still left with so many unanswered questions.
It's like we're trying to make sense of something that just doesn't make sense.
Yeah.
And the fact that he took his own life before facing trial, well, that just adds another layer of mystery to it all.
Absolutely. We'll never have his side of the story, his explanation for his actions. And for the families of the victims, that lack of closure has got to be incredibly difficult.
I can't imagine the pain of not knowing, and then there's the fact that some of the victims are still unidentified. It's just heartbreaking.
And we've talked about the 11 victims found at Fox Hollow Farm, but investigators believe there could be many more potentially linked to those I-70 Strangler killings.
It's a terrifying thought that the scope of his crimes might be even bigger than we realize.
And it makes you wonder how he was able to get away with it for so long. How did he evade detection for years, even with all those disappearances and the growing suspicion surrounding him?
I think it goes back to what we were talking about before, his outward success. He was this respected businessman, a family man. Did that create a blind spot for people, making it harder to believe that he could be capable of such awful things?
It's definitely possible. We as a society, we tend to have a hard time accepting that someone who seems so normal could also be a violent predator. It's easier to think that evil exists somewhere else, not in our own communities, not in someone we might know.
Baumeister's case definitely shatters that illusion.
Yeah.
And then there's the question of his mental illness. He was diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia and antisocial personality disorder as a teenager. Could that have played a role in his actions?
It's a question that comes up a lot in these kinds of cases, but it's important to remember that a mental illness diagnosis doesn't automatically equal violence. Plenty of people with those same diagnoses never hurt anyone.
That's a really important point to make. It's not about placing blame. It's about trying to understand the complexities of this case. So as we're wrapping up this deep dive, I keep thinking about his legacy. What will Herb Baumeister be remembered for?
That's a tough one. On one hand, he'll be remembered for the horrific crimes, the lives he destroyed, the pain he caused. But I also think it's important to remember the victims, to honor their memories, and to acknowledge the ongoing efforts to identify those who are still unknown.
I completely agree. The search for answers continues, and even small discoveries like the recent identification of Manuel Resendez, those offer a glimmer of hope for the families who are still waiting for closure.
And for those of us who are fascinated by true crime, Baumeister's case is a stark reminder that the darkness we explore in these stories, it's not just some abstract concept. It's a real and terrifying reality that can touch anyone, anywhere.
Well said. So to our listeners, thank you for joining us on this journey. It's been a tough case to explore, but I hope it sparks some important conversations about the complexities of human nature, the importance of mental health awareness, and the tireless pursuit of justice for victims and their families.
I think those are conversations that we always need to be having.
Absolutely. And with that, we'll wrap up this deep dive into the case of Herb Baumeister. Thanks again for listening, everyone.
Thanks for having me.